Whether you love him or hate him, and if you hate him seriously, what's wrong with you, it's hard to deny Spider-Man's place in pop culture. But given that there have been hundreds of artists and writers who have worked on his books over the years, it's not too surprising to learn that many of his stories have put a few people off comics for good. As I've mentioned far too much by now, he helped build Marvel, but he was also the one with a story that nearly tore the whole thing down. While many of his arcs are memorable for genuinely great reasons, there are some that are talked about thanks to their shock factor alone. That's not to say they aren't excellent stories told in an incredible book or anything, but these specific Spider-Man moments were so shocking in their brutality, cringiness, and sometimes because of the bold nature of their storytelling that they became unforgettable. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 Spider-Man moments that shocked the world. Number 10, SpiderMan Unmasked. If there's one thing that everyone knows about Spider-Man, it's that he keeps his secret identity, well, secret. While some of his enemies like Norman Osborn knew Peter Parker's alter ego and used that information to terrorize him, it was quite rare. This kept Peter somewhat separated from the people in his life, but it also kept them mostly safe from harm. And that's in spite of all the shenanigans his Aunt May got into over the years. Despite this, Peter Parker did something truly shocking in the pages of Civil War when he went in front of a bunch of cameras and revealed to the world that he was indeed Spider-Man. It was a huge moment and a total change for the character who'd had a secret identity since he was 15. It seemed like an event there would be no turning back from, which there was of course some issues later, but that's another story. Number 9, Buried Alive. Spider-Man has his fair share of enemies, but one of the most dangerous of all is Kraven. In Kraven's last hunt, the villain, well, hunts down Spider-Man and defeats him. Big K apparently shoots him dead. So the Nutty Hunter does what anyone would do when they slaughter a man in cold blood and buries him. Kraven then grabs the spare Spider-Man costume and goes gallivanting to prove he could be better at being Spider-Man than his nemesis ever was, which includes him beating the holy hell out of Vermin. After 2 weeks of shenanigans, Spider-Man wakes up from what turned out to be a tranquilizer dart and digs himself out of the grave. The story culminates in one of the most shocking events in Spider-Man's history as Kraven retires to his home and declares his hunting days over, and then shoots himself in the head with a rifle. Fortunately, he left behind evidence of his Spider-Man impersonation, which exonerated Spidey from the various crimes he seemingly committed while buried in the dirt. Number 8, Tearing Off The Symbiote. When Spider-Man first got his infamous black costume, it was a pretty big deal for the character. But Peter actually wore the symbiote costume for years before it started to become a problem. At first, it was something of a godsend, seeing as it could mimic any clothing and fire off webbing without the use of web shooters. That alleviated Spidey from most of his previous limitations, but it came at a cost. It turned out that the incredibly amazing suit that he had been wearing for so long was actually a living symbiotic being who wanted to bond with him permanently. Because it also tapped into his darker thoughts, Peter thought it best to rid himself of the useful black goo. When the time came to remove it, Spider-Man did it in a rather dramatic and explosive way. He went up into the bell tower of a church and literally tore it from his body as it writhed in agony from the sonic vibrations made by the bell. The anger and hatred that went into his removing of the symbiote led to the creation of Venom when it found a new home with Eddie Brock, who just coincidentally also hated Peter Parker and Spider-Man. Number 7, One More Day. Spider-Man has had 2 major loves in his life, but undoubtedly the most famous is Mary Jane Watson. She knew his secret, she accepted it, and for the most part, she put up with all of his bollocks. As mentioned though, the events of Civil War had some drastic consequences for Peter and his family. After he revealed his identity to the world, Aunt May and MJ were of course in danger. Initially, they were safe while under the protection of the Avengers in the mansion, but when Peter rebelled against Tony, all bets were off. It wasn't long before someone put their sights on Peter and his family then, but it was actually Aunt May who was shot by a sniper's bullet. She came very close to death, which is when Peter found and made a deal with Mephisto to save his aunt. His only catch, his entire relationship with Mary Jane would be completely wiped from history. The One More Day storyline shocked readers by reversing a long-time relationship that had come to define who Peter Parker was, and many were enraged at the audacity of the whole thing. Peter's identity was also made a secret all over again, but resetting the character so totally felt like an actual slap in the face. Number 6, the Clone Saga. Ask any Spider-Man fan which of the many crossover events is their favourite, and you would be hard-pressed to find a single one who would come up with the Clone Saga. Most fans hated it, but there are a few who appreciated the dynamic storytelling, which brought forth elements from the characters' early days into one cohesive story. Well, kinda cohesive. Whatever your thoughts on the event as a whole though, most people agree that the most shocking element was the revelation that the Peter Parker / Spider-Man we had been reading about for years was actually a clone. That was the big reveal from the series, and it pushed many fans to rage quit Spider-Man for good. The premise was that the wall crawler was the clone thought dead and disposed of from years earlier. Meanwhile, the guy running around claiming to be Ben Reilly / the Scarlet Spider was actually Peter Parker, the real one, all along. The proof was in some medical tests, but it was later revealed that those tests were actually manipulated by Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin. Confused? Yeah, that's not even the half of it. Number 5, Gwen Stacy and Norman Osborn's affair. In what is to be one of the more disturbing stories told about old Webhead, it turns out that Gwen Stacy and Norman Osborn, you know, the guy who killed her, had a couple of kids in a grossly contrived relationship pretty much nobody wanted to read. The story unfolded in an event called Sins Past, which revealed that Norman Osborn and Gwen Stacy had been doing the dirty sometime before her death. She traveled to France and gave birth to 2 children named Gabriel and Sarah Stacy, both of whom were raised by Norman. Because they had Norman's blood coursing through their veins, the twins aged at about 2 to 3 times the normal rate, making them full-grown adults in only a couple of years. They grew up believing that Peter was their real father and that he was responsible for their mother's death. All this is, of course, crazy, but the panels detailing the sexual escapades of Norman and Gwen, well, those are the stuff of nightmares. Number 4, the Lizard ate his kid. The Lizard has been one of the saddest and most tragic characters Spider-Man has ever tangled with. Kurt Connors' Jekyll and Hyde persona makes him genuinely sympathetic, and one of the only things that kept Kurt grounded was his little boy Billy as well as his wife Martha. However, even in his far scalier form, he still maintained a connection to his family. Well, until he didn't. What has to be the worst event in Dr. Kurt Connors' life, outside of losing his arm and becoming a super-villainous anthropomorphic crocodile anyway, the guy went and ate his kid. He just ate him up. It was always something that could never happen, but then, during the events of the Gauntlet, the Lizard is left in an alley with Billy, who he chomps down on like he's eating a Big Mac on a bad hangover. Even with the eventual return of the previously eaten boy, because of course he came back, Connors has still never been the man he was so many years ago. Number 3, Mallen eats Spidey's eye. Back in 2006, Spider-Man was put into a rather distressing event called The Other, which pitted him against Mallen, a being from Earth 001 who hunts down and kills all the Spider-Men of the multiverse. While dealing with the news that he's dying from an unknown disease, he meets up with Mallen, who decides to not fight Peter in his condition, preferring instead to watch him deteriorate and die. Peter enters the second act of the story trying to find a cure and deal with the emotional response to learning of his ultimate demise, with MJ and Aunt May along to help. Just when he thinks things are settling down for a bit though, Mallen attacks in a brutal onslaught that takes the fight all over the city. As Spider-Man gains the upper hand and it looks like he might win, Mallen, who is pretty much unscathed by this point, plucks out Peter's left eye and eats it. It was one of those things that came out of nowhere and shocked the readers almost as much as it must have shocked Mr. Parker. Number 2, swapping bodies with Doc Ock and then dying. When a superhero comic has been kicking along for 700 issues, you might expect the writers to shake things up a bit, but nobody could have imagined what actually came to pass when Amazing Spider-Man 700 hit shelves. Because one of Spider-Man's oldest foes finally got the better of him, and in one of the craziest ways imaginable, by taking over his body. Doc Ock was dying, and instead of spending his last remaining moments tied to his frail, withering corpse, he opted instead to transfer his mind into Spider-Man's body, and vice versa. In doing so, Peter succumbed to Dr. Octopus's terminal condition and actually died. Instead of telling the world who he was, Doc Ock decided to not become Spider-Man, but become better than him, as the superior Spider-Man. It was a crazy time, but ultimately Peter's mind was able to retake control and forced Otto out once and for all. Number 1, the night Gwen Stacy died. Gwen Stacy was Peter Parker's first true love, and her death was one of the most shocking events in comic book history up to that point. You know the drill. Until this event, few characters in the Marvel Universe were ever killed off in any meaningful way. Gwen's father went first, revealing in his dying breaths that he knew of Peter's true identity and even made him promise to always protect Gwen. That death changed Peter's outlook on life and how he managed the people in it. He swore to protect anyone who was ever close to him, but in the end, he wasn't able to protect the woman who was the closest of them all. When the Green Goblin threw Gwen from the bridge, Spider-Man did everything he could to save her, but his quick webbing only managed to snap her neck. That isn't to say he was responsible for the death, but his involvement certainly didn't ease his or readers' grief.